Bulgaria's Golden Sands resort is exactly what the name implies. It's a place of shimmering coastlines, endless sunshine, and a nightlife that never seems to sleep. For most young travelers, it is a paradise of cheap drinks and summer memories. And in the summer of 2014, 28-year-old Lars Mittank arrived here with his closest friends from Germany, looking for exactly that. Lars was the kind of person you'd call reliable. He had a steady job at a power plant, he was physically fit, and he was known for his calm, easygoing nature. There was no history of mental illness, no drug use, and certainly no reason for anyone to suspect that this vacation would be his last journey. The first few days were perfect. They spent their time on the beach, laughing and soaking in the Balkan sun. But as the week progressed, a subtle shift began to occur, a shift that is hard to pin down in hindsight. Lars began to act slightly out of character. It wasn't anything loud or explosive. It was more like a quiet withdrawal. While his friends were focused on the next party, Lars seemed to be looking at the horizon, as if he were watching something that no one else could see. The air in Golden Sands is heavy with the smell of salt and sunblock, but for Lars, the atmosphere was starting to feel heavy with something else, something claustrophobic. The turning point happened at a local McDonald's. It started as a trivial disagreement football, of all things. Lars was a fan of Werder Bremen, and he got into a heated exchange with a group of Bayern Munich fans. It was the kind of banter that happens in tourist towns every single night. But this time, it didn't end with a handshake. When Lars left the restaurant, he was confronted. In the dim light of the street lamps, a scuffle broke out. It was over in seconds, but the damage was done. Lars had been struck hard on the side of his head. He didn't lose consciousness, and he didn't seem badly hurt at first, but there was a strange, persistent ringing in his left ear. He told his friends he was fine, but as they walked back to their hotel under the pale moonlight, Lars was unusually quiet. He kept touching his ear, his eyes darting toward the shadows between the buildings. At that moment, the Golden Sands had lost its shimmer. The vacation was officially over, and the nightmare was just beginning to breathe. The morning after the confrontation at the McDonald's, the sun rose over the Black Sea with a blinding intensity. But for Lars Mittank, the world sounded different. The roar of the ocean and the chatter of tourists were muffled, replaced by a sharp, rhythmic throbbing in his left ear. It wasn't just pain, it was a physical barrier between him and reality. Lars decided to seek medical help. He went to a local doctor in the resort town, expecting perhaps some ear drops or a simple bandage. But after a brief examination, the doctor's expression turned serious. Lars had suffered a ruptured eardrum. It was a common enough injury in a fight, but it came with a terrifying catch. The doctor strictly forbade him from flying. In the medical world, this is a standard precaution. The change in cabin pressure during a flight can cause a perforated eardrum to collapse or lead to permanent hearing loss. To anyone else, this would be a massive inconvenience. To Lars, in his growing state of unease, it felt like a sentence. His friends were scheduled to fly back to Germany that very day. They offered to stay behind with him, to wait until he was cleared to travel by bus or train. But Lars, ever the stoic, insisted they go. He told them he would be fine for a few more days, that he would just find a cheap hotel, take his medication, and catch a bus later. It was a logical decision made by a rational man, or so it seemed. As Lars watched his friends pack their bags and head toward the airport, a profound sense of isolation began to settle over him. He was now alone in a foreign country, where he didn't speak the language, nursing a head injury that made every sound feel like a threat. He was prescribed an antibiotic called cefprozil. In the quiet of his room, as he stared at the small white pills, the silence of the hotel began to feel heavy. Without his friends to anchor him to the fun side of the vacation, Lars started to notice things he hadn't before. The way the hotel staff looked at him. The way the shadows stretched across the floor as the sun began to set. He moved from his luxury resort to a much cheaper, grittier place near the airport called Hotel Color. It was a transition from the light into the dark. As the door to his new, cramped room clicked shut, Lars Mittank was no longer a tourist on holiday. He was a man trapped on an island of his own making. And for the first time, the ringing in his ear began to sound like a warning. Hotel Color was not a place meant for relaxation. It was located in a grimmier part of Varna, a stark contrast to the sparkling pools of the Golden Sands. The walls were thin, the lighting was a flickering yellow, and the air felt stagnant, smelling of old cigarettes and industrial cleaner. As Lars checked in, he felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with his ear injury. He was now taking the cefprozil 500 ml regularly. While it is a standard antibiotic, Lars's reaction to it, or perhaps to the trauma of the injury itself, began to manifest in terrifying ways. He was becoming hyper-aware. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway sounded like a footstep. Every muffled voice from the next room sounded like a conspiracy being whispered in a language he couldn't understand. In the middle of the night, the paranoia finally broke the surface. Lars grabbed his phone and called his mother, Sandra, in Germany. His voice wasn't the calm, steady tone she was used to. It was a frantic, terrified whisper. He told her that he didn't feel safe in the hotel. He told her that 4 men were following him, that they were asking questions about him, and that he needed to cancel his credit cards immediately. Sandra tried to reason with him, but Lars was beyond reason. He was convinced that the men he had argued with at the McDonald's had tracked him down, or perhaps, in his clouded mind, they had hired someone to finish what they started. He began to pace the small room, his eyes fixed on the gap under the door. He was a prisoner of his own heightened senses. At one point during the night, the security cameras of Hotel Color captured a glimpse of Lars. He wasn't the relaxed traveler who had arrived in Bulgaria a week prior. He was seen huddled in the elevator, looking at the corners as if expecting someone to jump out. He would walk out into the hallway, stop, listen, and then retreat back into the shadows. He told his mother that he was hiding on a high floor, watching from the window, and that he was going to leave the hotel as soon as the sun came up. He didn't sleep a single second that night. The ringing in his ear had become a roar, and the small white pills on the nightstand looked less like medicine and more like part of the trap. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky over Varna, Lars Mittank prepared to run. But he didn't realize that you cannot outrun a shadow that is inside your own head. The hours between midnight and dawn are often the loneliest for a traveler, but for Lars, they were a battlefield. He was no longer just a man with a ruptured eardrum. He was a man convinced that he was being hunted. He spent the majority of the night on the phone with his mother, Sandra. These calls, which would later be analyzed by investigators and psychologists around the world, revealed a mind that was rapidly fracturing. "Sandra," he whispered into the receiver, his voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. "They won't let me leave. I can see them." When his mother asked who he was talking about, Lars couldn't give a clear answer. To him, they were just them. A faceless, nameless threat that existed in every shadow of the hallway. He told her that he was watching the men from his window, convinced that they were waiting for him to step outside, so they could snatch him. Sandra, sitting thousands of miles away in the safety of their home in Germany, could feel her heart sinking. She tried to offer practical solutions, suggesting he go to the police or talk to the hotel staff, but Lars shot every idea down. He believed the people around him were complicit. In his mind, the hotel was no longer a place of shelter. It was a cage. He was trapped on an upper floor, staring at the door handle, waiting for it to turn. At one point, Lars abruptly hung up. He sent a text message to his mother that simply read, "What is cefprozil 500? It was a moment of fleeting clarity. A realization that perhaps the chemicals in his blood were playing tricks on his brain. But that clarity didn't last. Soon, he was back on the phone, describing the men in the hallway again. He sounded like a man who was drowning while standing in a dry room. As the sun finally began to rise over Varna, casting a pale, sickly light over the industrial landscape, Lars made a sudden decision. He couldn't stay in the room any longer. He grabbed his bags and rushed out of the hotel, heading toward the one place he thought represented safety. The Varna airport. He believed that if he could just get past the security gates and onto a plane, the shadows would stay behind in Bulgaria. But as he stepped into a taxi, he didn't notice that he was leaving his sanity behind in the hotel room. The drive to the airport was short, but for Lars, it was a journey through a world that had become unrecognizable. While the phone calls to his mother provided a glimpse into Lars's internal terror, the security cameras at Hotel Color provided the external proof that something was deeply wrong. When investigators later reviewed the footage from that final night, they didn't see a criminal or a troublemaker. They saw a man who looked like he was being hunted by an invisible predator. The footage is grainy, tinted with that sickly green hue common to cheap security systems, which only adds to the unsettling atmosphere. In one sequence, the elevator doors slide open, and Lars steps inside. But he doesn't just stand there. He immediately retreats into the corner, pressing his back against the cold metal wall, his eyes fixed on the closing doors, as if he expects a hand to reach through at the last millisecond. He is clutching his cell phone like a talisman, his knuckles white. When the doors open on his floor, he doesn't just walk out. He lingers. He pokes his head out into the hallway, looking left and then right with a jerky, bird-like motion. His movements are not those of a person who is drunk or high. They are the movements of someone in a state of hypervigilance, a psychological condition, where the brain is convinced that a threat is imminent. Every shadow cast by a fire extinguisher, every flicker of the fluorescent lights, is interpreted by his brain as a hidden attacker. At another point in the night, he is seen walking down the hallway, only to suddenly stop and press himself against the wall. He stands perfectly still for several seconds, holding his breath, listening to the silence of the hotel. He seems to be playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek, with opponents that only he can see. This isn't the behavior of a man who is simply nervous about a flight. This is a total collapse of his sense of safety. To those watching the footage today, there is a profound sense of dread. You want to reach through the screen and tell him that he is safe, that the hallway is empty. But in Lars's reality, that hallway was a gauntlet. By the time he finally checked out in the early hours of the morning, he looked exhausted, his face pale, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. He walked out of the hotel lobby and into the morning air, leaving behind the only place that could have offered him a locked door. He was heading to the airport now, convinced that he was making a break for freedom, unaware that the cameras were capturing the final moments of the Lars Mittank the world used to know. The taxi ride from Hotel Color to the Varna airport should have taken less than 15 minutes. Under normal circumstances, it's a mundane route through the industrial outskirts of the city. But for Lars, sitting in the back seat of that car, every meter felt like a gamble. He watched the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, wondering if this stranger was part of the conspiracy he had built in his mind. He looked out the window at the passing cars, convinced that any one of them could be carrying the men who were hunting him. Despite the crushing weight of his paranoia, there was a small flicker of hope. In Lars's mind, the airport was a fortress. It was a place of rules, security guards, and bright lights. He believed that once he stepped inside those glass doors, he would be under the protection of the authorities. He messaged his mother one last time, telling her that he had made it to the terminal. It was a message of relief, a signal that the nightmare was almost over. When the taxi pulled up to the departure's curb, Lars paid the driver and stepped out into the morning air. The sun was higher now, reflecting off the glass facade of the airport. To any observer, He looked like just another traveler, a tall, athletic young man, carrying a backpack and a travel bag. But if you looked closer, you would have seen the signs of a man on the edge. His movements were too fast, his eyes never stopped moving, and he kept his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He walked into the terminal and began to navigate the crowd. The airport was busy, filled with families going on vacation and business travelers rushing to their gates. The noise was overwhelming. The announcements over the intercom, the rolling of suitcases, the hum of hundreds of voices. For someone with a ruptured eardrum and a fractured psyche, this sensory overload was likely agonizing. Lars went to the information desk, still focused on his one goal: getting home. He was told he needed to see the airport doctor first to get a formal, fit-to-fly certificate. This was the final hurdle. He made his way toward the medical center, located in a quieter wing of the airport. He believed that in a few minutes, a doctor would sign a piece of paper, and he would be on a plane back to Germany. He thought he was walking toward his salvation. In reality, he was walking toward the room where his life as a free man would effectively end. The quiet of the medical wing was a trap, and the silence he found there was about to become permanent. Lars stepped into the medical office of Dr. Kostov. The room was small, clinical, and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the terminal outside. For a moment, it seemed like Lars might finally be safe. Dr. Kostov described Lars as looking tired and somewhat stressed, which was understandable for someone who hadn't slept and was dealing with a painful ear injury. Lars sat down, and for about 45 minutes, the two men spoke. The conversation was mostly routine. Lars explained his injury, the fight at the McDonald's, and his desire to get back to Germany. Dr. Kostov began a standard examination. But as they talked, the doctor noticed that Lars was still incredibly tense. He wasn't just worried about his ear. He was still looking at the door, still listening for sounds in the hallway. He was a man whose nervous system was redlining, stuck in a state of permanent fight or flight. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. A construction worker, who was part of a crew doing renovations in the airport, opened the door to the medical office. He was just there to ask a quick question, or perhaps to use the facilities. He was wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying some tools. To a normal person, he was just a worker doing his job. But to Lars Mittank, this man was the physical manifestation of his deepest fears. The moment the worker entered, Lars's face went deathly pale. He stood up so abruptly that his chair nearly tipped over. He started to tremble, his eyes wide with a level of terror that Dr. Kostov had never seen in a patient before. Lars began to mumble, then shout, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." Dr. Kostov tried to calm him down, asking him what was wrong, but Lars wasn't listening anymore. The logic center of his brain had completely shut down. He didn't see a doctor's office. He saw a trap. He didn't see a construction worker. He saw an assassin. Without a word of explanation, Lars turned and bolted out of the room. He left behind his backpack, his travel bag, and even his wallet containing his ID and money. He ran out of the medical wing and back into the main terminal, fueled by a surge of adrenaline that was as powerful as it was dangerous. Outside the doctor's office, the security cameras of Varna Airport captured what would become one of the most debated videos in history. Lars Mittank is seen bursting out of the terminal doors. He isn't walking or even jogging. He is sprinting for his life. His arms are pumping. His head is tucked down, and his pace is that of a professional athlete. He looks like a man fleeing from an explosion, but if you look at the footage behind him, the terminal is calm. No one is chasing him. He runs across the airport's drop-off zone, weaving between parked cars and startled travelers. He doesn't look back once. At this point, Lars has nothing on him but the clothes he is wearing, a yellow t-shirt and blue shorts, and his cell phone. His luggage, his passport, and his future are all sitting on the floor of the doctor's office, miles behind him in his mind. The camera follows him as he reaches the edge of the airport property. Most people, when faced with a barrier, would stop and look for an exit. But Lars doesn't even hesitate. He reaches the perimeter fence, a formidable structure nearly 8 feet tall, topped with jagged barbed wire, designed to keep intruders out of the airfield. To a man in a state of pure, primal panic, the fence wasn't a barrier. It was a ladder. Witnesses and investigators, who later analyzed the scene, were stunned by the speed at which he scaled it. He climbed the wire with his bare hands, seemingly indifferent to the sharp metal digging into his skin. In a matter of seconds, he was over the top and dropping down onto the other side. Beyond that fence lay a vast, open field of sunflowers and dense forest. As Lars hit the ground, he didn't stop to catch his breath. He kept running, his yellow shirt a bright flash of color against the green stalks of the sunflowers, until the distance and the shadows swallowed him whole. The cameras recorded the exact moment he vanished from the civilized world. He didn't fade away. He charged into the unknown. One moment he was a traveler at an international airport, and the next, he was a ghost in the Bulgarian wilderness. The sun continued to shine, the planes continued to land, but Lars Mittank was gone. Beyond the perimeter fence of Varna Airport, the world changes instantly. It's no longer a place of glass, steel, and international security. It is a vast, desolate expanse of agricultural land and dense, tangled woodland. This area is dominated by massive fields of sunflowers plants that grow tall and thick, creating a natural labyrinth that can easily swallow a grown man. When Lars dropped down from that fence, he wasn't just entering a field. He was entering a void. The authorities were alerted almost immediately. Security guards who had seen the man climb the wire went to the spot where he had disappeared. They looked over the fence, expecting to see a confused tourist walking nearby, perhaps injured from the barbed wire. But there was nothing. The sunflowers stood still in the heat of the Bulgarian summer, their large yellow faces nodding slightly in the breeze. There was no rustling of leaves, no shouting for help, no sound of footsteps. A search was organized within hours, but it was hampered by a fundamental question. Why? The police were baffled. They had his bags, his wallet, and his ID. There was no evidence of a struggle. To the local police, it looked like a man had simply chosen to run into the woods. They didn't understand the level of terror Lars was feeling. They didn't know about the frantic calls to his mother, or the shadow men in the hotel hallway. As the first night approached, the temperature in the fields began to drop. Lars was out there in nothing but a t-shirt and shorts. He had no food, no water, and his phone, his only link to the outside world, would soon run out of battery. Investigators brought in search dogs, hoping to pick up his scent from the fence. The dogs followed a trail for a short distance into the stalks, but then they stopped. They began to circle, confused. It was as if Lars had simply evaporated into the humid air. The silence that followed was heavy. Back in Germany, Sandra Mittank sat by her phone, waiting for the call that her son had been found. She imagined him cold and scared, hiding in the dark, waiting for someone he could trust. She didn't know that the someone Lars was looking for no longer existed in his mind. He was alone in the sunflowers, and for the first time in his life, he was completely invisible to the rest of the world. Days turned into weeks, and weeks bled into months. In the beginning, there was a frantic energy to the search. Private investigators were hired, flyers with Lars's face were plastered across every bus station and train terminal in Varna, and local volunteers combed through the sunflower fields until the stalks were dry and brown, but every lead led to a dead end. Every sighting of a tall, blonde man turned out to be someone else. The trail hadn't just gone cold, it had ceased to exist. Back in Germany, the silence in the Mittank household was deafening. Sandra Mittank kept her son's room exactly as he had left it, as if any small change might signal that she had given up hope. She spent her nights staring at her phone, the same phone that had once carried Lars's terrified whispers. She replayed those final conversations in her head thousands of times, searching for a clue she might have missed. A name? A location? A reason? But there was nothing but the sound of his ragged breathing and the background noise of a Bulgarian night. As the official police search began to scale back, the digital world took over. The CCTV footage of Lars running from the airport was uploaded to the internet, and it went viral almost instantly. Millions of people watched those few seconds of film. They analyzed the way his arms moved, the shadows under his eyes, and the way he looked back not at a person, but at something invisible. The internet became a global detective agency. People from every corner of the world offered theories. Some said he was a victim of human trafficking, others argued he had joined a local cult, and many more pointed to the Sef Brazil theory. But behind the screen and the speculation, there was a real mother waiting for a real son who had disappeared into thin air. The silence of the Bulgarian fields had traveled all the way to Germany. It was a silence that didn't just mean a lack of sound. It meant a lack of answers. The world was beginning to know Lars Mittank as a mystery, a case study, or a viral video. But to those who loved him, he was just a young man who had gone on vacation and never stepped off the plane. The mystery was no longer about a flight he missed. It was about the void he left behind, a void that was growing wider with every passing second of silence. If you close your eyes and imagine that grainy, wide-angle shot of the airport exit, you can almost feel the heat of that July morning. The footage of Lars Mittank running is only a few seconds long, but it is packed with anomalies that have kept investigators awake for over a decade. When you watch it closely, you notice that Lars isn't just running. He is sprinting with a level of focus that is terrifying. He doesn't have his bags. He doesn't have his shoes tied properly. He is a man stripped of everything but the instinct to survive. One of the most chilling details is his posture. Most people running from a physical threat will occasionally look over their shoulder to see how close their pursuer is. Lars doesn't do that. He keeps his eyes locked dead ahead, as if the danger isn't behind him, but everywhere. His arms are pumping in perfect synchronization, showing no signs of the physical exhaustion he should have been feeling after a sleepless night of paranoia. It is the visual definition of an adrenaline-dumped body pushed to its absolute limit by a mind that has declared a state of emergency. Then, there is the transition. He moves from the concrete of the airport terminal to the grass of the perimeter fence with zero hesitation. In the footage, he looks small against the massive backdrop of the airfield, a lone yellow dot moving across a gray and green landscape. When he reaches the fence, the camera angle is far away, but you can see the sheer fluidity of his movement. He doesn't struggle with the height. He doesn't pause to find a foothold. He scales the wire like it's a natural extension of his path. Experts who study body language have pointed out that his flight was incredibly direct. He wasn't wandering or looking for help. He was heading for the most inaccessible place he could find. The moment he drops onto the other side of the fence, he enters a blind spot where the cameras can no longer track him. He disappears into the high grass not like a victim, but like someone who wants, more than anything else, to be invisible. This footage is the last time any camera, any sensor, or any human eye could confirm his location. It is the final frame of his life as we know it, leaving the world to wonder. What did he see that we couldn't? The area beyond the Varna airport fence is a place where nature and industry collide in the most unforgiving way. To a casual observer, it's just a field. But to a search team, it is a nightmare of logistics. The sunflower fields, which look so beautiful from a distance, are actually dense, stifling labyrinths. During the month of July, these plants can reach heights of 7 or 8 feet. Their stalks are thick, their leaves are broad, and they grow so close together that they create a canopy that blocks out the sun and traps the heat. If a man were to lie down just 5 feet into the field, he would be completely invisible to anyone standing on the road. Beyond the sunflowers lies a sprawling forest known for its thick undergrowth and uneven terrain. This isn't a manicured park. It's a rugged, wild landscape filled with ravines, hidden ditches, and dense thickets of thorns. For a man like Lars, who was likely experiencing a massive surge of cortisol and adrenaline, this terrain wouldn't have slowed him down initially, but it would have been a death trap once that adrenaline faded. Search teams used every tool available. They deployed thermal imaging cameras from helicopters, hoping to catch a heat signature in the cool of the night. They sent in dogs trained to track human scent through the harshest conditions. But the Bulgarian summer is brutal. The high temperatures and the wind can dissipate scent molecules in hours. The thermal cameras were often confused by the heat radiating from the baked earth and the dense foliage. Every time the searchers thought they had a lead, the forest seemed to push them back. The most haunting realization for the investigators was the sheer scale of the nowhere. Once Lars crossed that fence, he had access to hundreds of square miles of unpopulated land. He could have walked for days without hitting a major road or a village. In his state of mind, he wasn't looking for a path. He was looking for a hiding spot. He was looking for a place where the men in the shadows couldn't find him. As the sun set on that first day, the wilderness didn't just hide Lars Mittank, it absorbed him. The fence was the border between the world of logic and a world of primal silence, and Lars had stepped across it with no intention of coming back. In the search for answers, investigators eventually turned their focus to the small white pills Lars had been prescribed, cefprozil. It is a common second-generation antibiotic, used by millions of people every year to treat basic infections. On paper, it is safe. But when you look into the rare, documented side effects of this class of medication, a chilling possibility begins to emerge. Could a simple antibiotic have triggered a total psychological collapse? While extremely rare, there are recorded cases of antibiotic-induced psychosis. For some individuals, certain chemicals can cross the blood-brain barrier and cause vivid hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a loss of contact with reality. If Lars's body had a specific sensitivity to the drug, the 500 milligrams dose he was taking might have turned his mind into a house of mirrors. The men he saw in the hallway, the voices he heard whispering, and the conviction that he was being hunted, all of it could have been a chemical storm inside his brain. But the mystery goes deeper. Lars had also suffered a physical blow to the head during the fight at the McDonald's. Doctors have speculated that the combination of a mild concussion, the ruptured eardrum, and the medication might have created a perfect storm. A brain that is already struggling with trauma is far more vulnerable to the side effects of drugs. To Lars, the paranoia wouldn't have felt like a side effect. It would have felt like the absolute truth. However, many medical experts remain skeptical. They argue that even with psychosis, the level of physical coordination Lars showed scaling a fence and sprinting for miles is unusual. They ask, was it the medicine, or was the medicine just a catalyst for something that was already dormant in his mind? There is no way to know for sure. The package of cefprozil was found in his luggage, left behind in the doctor's office. It sat there, a silent witness to his disappearance, holding the secret to whether it was a cure or the very thing that drove him into the dark. Without Lars, the pills are just chemicals. With Lars, they might have been the key to his vanishing act. While the medical theory focuses on what was happening inside Lars's head, there is another, much darker line of thinking that many investigators and internet sleuths refuse to ignore. What if Lars wasn't hallucinating? What if the men he saw in the hallway were real? Bulgaria's Golden Sands is a beautiful resort, but like many tourist hubs, it has a shadowy underbelly involving organized crime and human trafficking. The theory suggests that the fight at the McDonald's wasn't just a random scuffle over football. Some believe Lars might have inadvertently crossed the wrong people, perhaps locals with ties to a criminal network. In this version of the story, the Bayern Munich fans Lars argued with weren't just tourists. but individuals who didn't take kindly to an outsider's defiance. This would explain why Lars told his mother he felt watched, and why he was so insistent on canceling his credit cards. He wasn't just afraid of shadows. He was afraid of being tracked. When Lars panicked in the doctor's office upon seeing the construction worker, some argue it was a trigger response. In his heightened state of fear, any man in a uniform or a vest represented the people he thought were coming for him. But if there were real pursuers, they didn't need to chase him over the fence. They simply had to wait. A tall, blonde, foreign man wandering alone in the Bulgarian countryside, without a phone, money, or ID, is an easy target. If Lars was intercepted after he left the airport's perimeter, it would explain why no trace of him was ever found in the sunflower fields. No clothing, no remains, nothing. It's as if he was plucked from the earth. The problem with this theory is the lack of evidence. No one else saw these mysterious men. No one was caught on CCTV following him. But in the world of true crime, the absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. To this day, many wonder if Lars Mittank was a victim of a very real, very human predator that used the chaos of his panic to make him disappear forever. He might have been running from a ghost, or he might have been running directly into the arms of the very people he feared.